people and countries in the region. Our first of all, we have three very, very distinguished scholars, internationally known, and I don't think none of them really needs any introduction. Our first distinguished and prominent scholar is Professor Shlomo Avineri, that I happen to be one of his students. Of course, he doesn't remember that. It was in the 1960s. He had just finished his PhD, and he was the expert on Marx and his thought and his importance, of course, both in politics and in other areas of European and general history. So, as Professor Menashri offered, and I take that suggestion, I want to read the biography and the contributions of Professor Shlomo Avineri, as you all have it in the brochure before you. And without further ado, I invite Professor Avineri to present his paper on the Islamic Republic and the Dialectics of Political Development. Professor Avineri, please.
Thank you very much. As you realize, I'm totally unqualified to speak on the subject. This was, I think, the subtext which I recognize of this very generous introduction. And I am really very thankful to David Menashri, Professor Menashri, and the University of Tel Aviv University, having invited me, because I do not know much about the subject. And like 7 million other Israelis, I'm an expert on Iranian nuclear power, because everybody in this country is an expert on this. I'm less an expert than some other people. Some of my best friends are Iranian Jews, especially in Los Angeles, which may or may not qualify me. I have visited Iran several times in different circumstances. One of the most magnificent coffee table books at my home is an exquisite edition of Shahnameh, which was published by Sayyid Hussein Nasser in the good old bad days of the Shah. But besides that, I do not have any expertise on Iran. So please bear with me, and I ask the forgiveness of all the experts who know. Bear with me when I try to bring into the debate about the Iranian Revolution and the regime which has been established by the Iranian Revolution an outsider's perspective and a comparative perspective, which may or may not be adequate to understand something which is a very unique phenomenon in recent world history, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Perhaps one of the most important things to me as an outsider is to try to realize how important it is to extricate the debate and the discussion and the analysis of Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran, to extricate it from what is usually called Middle Eastern studies. Because when we say Middle Eastern studies, most people have in their mind the Arab world. Most people, at least intelligent people, know that Iranians are not Arabs. There are some people who don't know it, I know that. But intelligent people do know that Iranians are not Arabs. But when you say Iranians are not Arabs, it's like saying Jews are not Christians, but let's talk about it. Now, this is not the case. One has to look at Iran not out of the context of the Arab Middle East, but in terms of a political culture and political history and intellectual history which does not becloud our understanding of Iran because we think we know something about the Arab Middle East. And to try to look at Iran on its own merits, or lack of that, in terms of its own history, is intellectually something which is not always easy to do when you are a Middle Eastern expert, especially in this country, but also in the United States. So looking at Iran as an appendage of Middle Eastern studies, which really means Arab Muslim countries, is already creating a distortion of the understanding of Iranian society. Let me just give one or two examples why this seems to me to be important. Iran, historically, modern Iran, has had a very unique history, which in the mind of many Iranians, less so in the mind of people coming from outside, has to do with a development which is very different from any development which we find in the Arab Middle East. And this is a 1906 constitutional revolution. No Arab country had a constitutional revolution. Turkey, more or less at the same time, had a revolution which was somehow different. It had a constitutional aspect, but it was basically an ethno-national revolution trying to Turkicize the Ottoman Empire. The fact and the memory of the failed revolution of 1906 is a reality which puts Iran's history and the view many Iranians view their own history in a very different way. The same has to do with the Mossadegh revolution, which in many cases is being viewed as just one of the anti-American, anti-Western development in the Middle East in the late 40s and 50s. But you compare this to the one revolution which was very anti-Western and very significant in the Arab Middle East, and this is the Egyptian revolution. And here again you have a very different structure. Whatever you say about the Egyptian revolution, it was a military coup d'etat. Mossadegh's revolution was not a military coup d'etat. It had a very complex history. It had at that time been viewed by the West as something which may draw Iran into the Soviet orbit because of the two-day party. But it was not a military coup d'etat. So when you look at those two things, you realize you deal here in the 20th century, I'm not going back to Cyrus and Iranian history, but in the 20th century, a very, very different set of developments, which are very different. And of course they can be compared, but they are very different from anything which we do have in the Arab Middle East. When the Iranian Revolution occurred, and in its first stages it was not yet clear how far it will go, if at all, into an Islamicist direction, some of the political science literature, because we political scientists like in comparative studies, we like to put things in a structure of a theory, there were attempts to compare it to the French Revolution, to the Soviet Revolution. In the last few years, a little bit propagandistic way, there were some attempts to compare it with fascism or Nazism for obvious reasons, which are partly propagandistic, but not only so. I would like to suggest to you a framework of looking at the Iranian Revolution in a very different way. It is comparative, it is not regional, and it may be wrong. But I think it may be helpful to concentrate our minds on some of the developments in Iran. I would like to compare it with the Puritan Revolution in Great Britain, or England as it was then, in the 17th century. And I'll try to explain why. There are a number of things which the Iranian Revolution and Puritanism have in common. They were responses to modernity. Puritanism, going back to Calvin in Geneva, not just British English Puritanism, but going back to Calvin in Geneva, was an attempt to respond to the Renaissance, to modernity, to the beginnings, if you wish, of secularization, not yet secularization, but the beginning of secularization. It had a very ascetic element, and the asceticism is obvious both in Puritanism and also in the Iranian Revolution. It was bibliocentric in the sense that it was trying to recreate or reimagine or reinvent a society that supposedly existed one time in the past because we have the biblical or the book about it. the Puritans viewed themselves as a true Israel, or if you wish, they viewed themselves as the original Christian community before it was corrupted by the Bishop of Rome and Catholicism. The idea that you try to create a society which is based on the precepts of an historical book, and you make the book and the knowledge of the book and the study of the book very central to your own understanding and interpretation and invention of your own political structure. Obviously, to try to create in 17th century England something like the original Christian community after the immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was a little absurd as it is to try to create in Iran in the 20th century a society which is based on the precept of 7th century Islam. But the idea that you go back to the roots, you go back to a pristine, not yet corrupted version of your own religion and of your own society. Why am I making that comparison? So one level is a level that is something similar. In this respect, the Iranian Revolution is much more in its precepts akin to the Puritan Revolution than it is to the French or the Soviet or certainly the fascist or Nazi revolution. But there is something else. We try, in our understanding of the development of Western democracy, especially of British democracy and British parliamentarism, to relate it to Puritanism. In any interpretation of English history, and not only in the Whig version of English history, the idea is that out of Protestantism, out of the Puritan Revolution, came the seeds of parliamentary power, parliamentary supremacy, and eventually democracy. What we tend sometimes to forget is that if you look at Calvinist Protestantism, which is really the sort of British Puritanism, it was anything but democratic. It was authoritarian, it was centralist, it was what we would call today totalitarian. If you imagine what it meant to live in Calvin's Geneva or in Britain in the 17th century, this was the most repressive society at that time, much more repressive than Catholicism, which went through counter-reformation but was already imbued with ideas of the Renaissance. And, you know, Catholicism a little bit more forgiving than Puritanism, if I may say so. Who is a Jew to say anything like this about two Christian religions? But basically, Puritanism was the most intrusive kind of Christian version of political leadership. It was persecuting minorities. It was iconoclastic, of course. It was trying to go back to purity. It determined the status of women in a very negative way, much more negative than women were able to achieve at that time in the Catholic countries. It was trying to determine the way family, education, sumptuary laws about what or what cannot be consumed, and it had a very harsh penal system. Living in Calvin's Geneva, or later on living in Cromwell's England, was living in a very unpleasant and very oppressive society. But it did, and this is where I bring in the dialectics of the title, but it did contribute in a very significant way to the development of modern representative government. How come? What Puritanism did was to move the focus of the structure of politics and society from a church hierarchy to the community of believers. No bishop, no priest, the community of believers. The direct ability of the good Christian, Protestant, Calvinist Christian, to communicate or commune directly with the Almighty without the necessity of a church mediation. Once you move from a hierarchical church structure, at the top of which you have either bishops or cardinals or archbishops or a pope, who tell you what is true or not, what is the true word of God. Once you move from there to a community of believers, and this happened initially in Geneva, later on in Britain, you, at the end of the day, without any democratic ideology, vest political power in the hands of the community. Because there is no bishop, there is no church, there is no hierarchy. So despite the fact that Puritanism was authoritarian, Puritanism was not aiming at democracy, by focusing on the community of believers, you open the road to democratic structures. And when you look through the vicissitudes of the Puritan Revolution in Britain, you see how there are debates not only in Parliament, which at one time or other Cromwell dispersed, but also among the army of what is the right way to relate to God. The debates of the army, the Puritan army, about theological issues, political issues, representative issues, are the first time a popular group in Europe debated how the country, how the church should be run. What I'd like to suggest is that we have the same kind or analogous structure in Iran. Without going into too many differences between the Sunni and the Shias, about which I know again very little, and I hear people who know it, but once you look at the constitution of the Islamic Republic, and the word democracy does appear there, and we in the West sometimes look at it with question marks, and justly so. But the fact of the matter is that once you go to the community of believers, to the Ummah as it is constituted in the Islamic Republic, you have the ingredients of a representative system. And the fact of the matter is, it may not be very popular to say it in Israel, because we know how we feel about Iran, especially since Ahmadinejad's statements, etc. I don't have to go into it. But with the exception of Israel and Turkey, one country in the Middle East which has a form or a sort of a representative government, sort of elections, is Iran. Now, we know that elections in Iran are not free. We know that there is a way in which they are not only manipulated, but the issue who can be candidate is being subjected to all kinds of religious criteria. Let me remind you that until 1825, only members of the Church of England could vote in England. Never mind Jews, never mind Catholics, never mind other Protestants. Only members of the Church of England. But there was a community that was viewed as a legitimate community where elections take place, and elections in Iran do take place. We do not know who the next president of Iran is. Some of us have our views and our preferences. But whoever is going to be, he's not going to be elected by 95% of the voters, as in some other countries in the Middle East. And the present president was elected in a second round, which were, and both rounds were very deeply contested. Debates in the Majlis, the little I know about it, are obviously not open debates. You have to be kosher in an Islamic sense. Excuse me for mixing them. You have to get a kashrut in order to run for parliament. I know all this. But this is not a system where the parliament, where the Majlis is just raising their hands as they do in the old Soviet Union and in some of the neighboring Arab countries. There is serious debate, and there is serious debate about issues within the legitimate, and this is the only legitimate Islamic discourse. There is a debate there about the role of women, about what the rule of the elders of the church mean, but there is a debate. The fact of the matter is that the present president, President Ahmadinejad, didn't get approval of his first choices for ministers, members of the cabinet. Never mind that this didn't happen in any of the Arab Muslim countries. It suggests that there is a openness, and this is grafted upon a very vibrant civil society with a very strong tradition of civil society and internal debate. Now, of course, this is oppressive in the sense that if you are not within the kosher Islamic discourse, you cannot express yourself. We know that even within this Islamic discourse, it is being manipulated by revolutionary guards, by intimidations. But there is a discourse, and again, we do not know who the next president of Iran is going to be. He's going to be elected, and not by 95 or 70% of the population. Now, does this mean that Iran is deterministically on the road to full-fledged democracy and open society, from Puritanism to parliamentarism, as it was in England? No, it's not preordained, and it's not deterministically predetermined. What I'm trying to suggest is that you have here a foundation out of which there's a very strong possibility that within that Islamic system, not by trying to undermine it or overthrow it, that's probably not going to happen, but through internal developments, the internal logic and dialectics of a system where you have elections, limited as they are, where you have, and I hate to say it about the Iranian Revolution because I may be misunderstood, there is a balance of power. There's a balance of power among different institutions. One of the reasons is because there is great suspicion among the framers of the Iranian constitution. There's great suspicion about the abuse of power. And this suspicion comes from not democratic considerations, it comes from Islamic considerations. But the matter is that as a consequence of that, the president is not the commander-in-chief. The person who is the commander-in-chief cannot prorogue parliament, cannot dismiss the president. You have a system which is sometimes difficult to understand, which is sometimes not understood outside Iran rightly, but it is a system where you do not have one focus of political power. And the power play is not just between personalities, which you have in every system, but it is between institutions. And the balance between those institutions is changing, but it is written into the constitution. Now here you've got some elements which do not have to, but can further develop. I wish that our Arab neighbors would have, without the ideology, a system which is as open, as internally challenged as in Iran. I wish that we could say that we do not know who the next Egyptian president is. Well, we do not know who the next Egyptian president is. We do not know, but we do know that he is not going to be elected in first or second round of elections. We know exactly who is going to decide under what conditions, who's the next Egyptian president, who's the next Syrian president, etc. is going to be. It has been said that it's very difficult to prophesy, especially about the future, and therefore I'm perhaps not going to prophesize, but let me make a statement. 20 years from now, if I'm going to be asked, which country in the Middle East, 20 years from now, has a chance of becoming or developing as closely as possible to what we would consider a legitimate form of democracy, I think I can say with some assurance, I'm putting my head on the block, okay, that probably the chances that it's going to be Iran is greater than the chance that it's going to be any of the other countries in the Middle East. This is not usually the discourse in which we, especially in Israel, discuss Iran. The other issues are very serious, and I leave it to the experts. But when one looks, does it mean my time is up?
No, well, your time is up, but that wasn't intended.
But I think when one looks at a fascinating country with a history that has to be understood on its own terms and its own discourse, we should do justice to our own understanding, not just to Iranian society, but to our own understanding and to our ability to project the future developments both in Iran itself and in the region. Thank you very much.
thank you very much, Professor Avineri, for your very interesting and thought-provoking and very, very uncommon perspective of Iran today and its potential for progress towards a more inclusive and representative regime. People who naturally in different disciplines get so much preoccupied by their own field that they oftentimes they ignore parallels that are very relevant to the same topics and the same issues. And I'm very thankful for your presentation. I'm sure so are the other people who have listened to your presentation.